Sorry, everyone, for the technology issues this morning. All right, I am thrilled to be here, and the energy for this conference is incredible. I'm so honored to be here today talking about the deaf community and how the deaf community can be part of this conversation. So, okay, so let me introduce myself. I just completed my postdoc. Well, I completed medical school and realized that I wanted more research experience. I wanted to understand more about the deaf community. I am a deaf woman myself, but I don't represent all of the various deaf experiences within the deaf community. So I just completed my postdoc this past summer, and I've just started my new job as a research assistant professor at RIT NTID in Rochester, New York, in the Center on Culture and Language. Specifically, I run the Deaf Health Lab within the NTID Center on Culture and Language. And I'll be talking today about the project from my postdoc. So first, I want to acknowledge my grant support from these sources and also share that my opinion and my presentation does not represent the opinion of my funders. It's my own opinion. And I want to start by giving some background about reproductive justice issues within the deaf community. So I want to start by explaining who is part of the deaf community and several different perspectives on that. For many years, the medical model was dominant. The medical model was dominant, meaning a focus on auditory ability or lack of ability for deaf people, and that includes the use of the word hearing impaired, which is an inappropriate term. The cultural model is that deaf people are deaf. That includes deaf-blind people and deaf people with disabilities. Now, one thing that is interesting in terms of the use of hearing impaired by doctors is that it's not often intended in a negative way. Many people just don't realize that that's an inappropriate term. I have had to educate people to use the term deaf, and I often get a positive response from that education and advocacy. They think that hearing impaired is more formal, but in truth, it's not. It is a term with negative connotations. I mentioned deaf disabled and the shift to realizing that deaf people are disabled. More and more deaf people are accepting that now. In the past, there's been a lot of resistance to that because of the idea that disabilities are bad. That implies that there's something wrong with us. And of course, we know that that's not true, that culture is not disabling, but the mainstream can be disabling. And also that there's nothing wrong with disabled people or having a disability. So now more people are recognizing that and having the power to make change. Each of these two models have different role models for the idea of success. So when hearing parents realize that they have a deaf child, they may want to make their child like a normal hearing person, but that's not the best approach. Deaf adults can be successful as deaf adults, and it's important that parents recognize that and recognize that their child will be fine, and they need to figure out the best way for their child as a unique individual to succeed. And the deaf view of disability has been like the medical model for a long time. That view of deafness is something that needs to be fixed. But instead, we recognize ourselves as a socio-cultural and linguistic minority with unique experiences. Our experiences as a deaf person are unique compared to other minority groups, and we use American Sign Language. Now, health literacy is important to start with here because health literacy impacts people in many different ways. There are many downstream issues of health literacy. Health literacy means the skills, knowledge, and ability to take information, process it, understand it, and apply it to one's own healthcare decisions and decisions about their health. The reason why this is important is because studies have found that deaf people who use sign language are 7 times more likely than their hearing peers to lack sufficient health literacy. They aren't able to access information, they may not be able to understand information, or they may not be able to apply information to their healthcare. And that lack of health literacy impacts people who use the healthcare system. And of course, that affects their health. For example, when someone goes to the emergency room, deaf people go to the emergency room twice as often as hearing people. And the emergency department is often more prepared. They have a system ready and they know what to do when a deaf person shows up in terms of getting an interpreter and appropriate access services, compared to other doctors' offices may not know how to get an interpreter, may not be willing. But we know that deaf people showing up at the emergency room is not the best option for them and also leads to more expenses. Deaf people are also less likely to know about preventative health in terms of cancer, cardiac health, etc. And a big reason why is because of communication and language access barriers. Okay, so as I just explained, lack of health literacy affects people that they don't know how to get health information or how to access information from their doctors. And so now that also applies to birth control, contraception, and STDs. Deaf people are more likely to rely on withdrawal and condoms, and we know that those two methods are not effective. We know that that can result in unwanted pregnancies. And one study has also found that deaf respondents, more than hearing respondents, said that in the past year, they had had 2 or more different sexual partners. But I do want to caution on that this study, so my caution about this study is that hearing people answered these questions by phone. And so it is possible that they edited their responses because there was a person on the other side of the line, where the deaf study takers took a computer survey. So it is possible that that's part of the reason for the disparity, but that evidence still shows that there is some more incidence of risky behavior, and that risky behavior can lead to higher incidences of unplanned pregnancies. And sure enough, deaf women have 60% higher odds of having an unplanned pregnancy. And doctors and medical providers often aren't able to fully communicate with deaf patients, meaning that deaf patients are at a higher risk for poor access for maternal healthcare access and maternal healthcare services. That has an impact on their healthcare as well as their access to information. Okay, so now I want to dial in more on why I think that this is a very important topic and more than just a social, we know that this is already important, but for the medical point of view, I also want to emphasize this in another way. Now, we cannot concretely say that these two things are correlated, but in my research, I found that risk factors keep showing up. And if risk factors show up in many different ways, I want to walk you through this diagram of risk factors that I've seen in my research. If a person has an unintended pregnancy, then often they will not breastfeed their child postpartum. And that is a risk, not necessarily a risk, but that is something that occurs more often with deaf women. And of course, we know that there are some factors of deaf culture that also encourage stronger connection and stronger community with other deaf women who can encourage breastfeeding. But we still notice that the breastfeeding that occurs within deaf women is not as long as hearing women. And deaf women also don't have access to providers who can communicate with them in their native language. So that impacts their use of breastfeeding. Now, in terms of delayed and prenatal care, deaf women often don't get delayed or prenatal care. So they may go to the doctor and not have an interpreter, or they may go and not have a qualified interpreter, so they don't feel that they're fully heard by the doctor or that they can get full access. Postpartum depression has a higher incidence rate for unintended pregnancies, so that can also affect deaf women's mental health. We don't have a good metric for postpartum depression in deaf women. Now, it's not an easy process to just translate the postpartum depression scale into ASL. There have to be cultural considerations involved in that conversion process, and we are working on that currently. So we know that postpartum measurements of deaf women is not perfect, but we also know that deaf women have higher incidences of mental health issues, including depression. IPV, intimate partner violence during pregnancy, is correlated with unintended pregnancy as well. Within the deaf population, not necessarily those who are pregnant, but within the deaf population in general, they do have a higher incidence of experiencing IPV. Having a shorter IPI, that means the time between pregnancies, the interpregnancy interval from the time that one child is delivered to the time that the woman becomes pregnant next. That should be greater than 18 months, but with unintended pregnancies, we often notice that the IPI is shorter. So that leads to 3 outcomes: early birth, having a birth with a weight, and having placental abruption. And for those people who experience short IPI and people who experience IPV, we know that those both occur more often within the deaf community. But again, we don't have statistics to prove the correlation between these, but we can assume that there is some relationship between them. And in the future, I would like to research that more. First, I want to talk more with the community. And so I decided what to do first before jumping into this quantitative research project was to do qualitative interviews with deaf women to get a better understanding of what their experiences are like. That includes what they need, what they want, and what they've gone through. So in 2019, I interviewed 20 deaf ASL using women and 20 hearing women who use spoken English. The ages were 21 to 44, and they all lived in Western upstate New York. I collected information about their background demographics and then did a data analysis of themes that came up from these interviews. And I will do a more in-depth formal analysis soon. I also want to add to this that I did almost all the interviews myself, and I gave women of color to have the option if they preferred to have a different interviewer. But all of them said that they were happy to interview with me. So this is a small sample size. This is only 40 women altogether, 20 deaf and 20 hearing. So we can't say that these are representative of all experiences. But I wanted to look at the deaf community, of course. And so I wanted to find similar participant demographics that reflect the wider community in Monroe County where I live. I did that to a certain extent. And I should have included more diversity, but I wanted to have a representative demographic, and I did have that. About 70% of the participants are white, so please do be mindful of that this is a limited sample, and the majority are white. The majority of them were also around 30 years old. They had higher education. And this is not shown here, but all of the women I interviewed were cisgender women. I asked them about their biological sex identified at birth and their current gender identification, and they were all cisgender. They are all in heterosexual relationships. Almost all of them were in heterosexual relationships. And so then I asked about their contraceptive use. And you can see here that there is a bit of divide, and I want to caution again that this is a small sample size. But it's interesting to see some of the patterns that appear here. Deaf people of color, again, there were only 2 out of 6 of the deaf women of color who used birth control. Compared to hearing people, there were 5 out of 6 hearing people of color who used birth control. Of those who said that they did not use birth control, I asked them what their reasons were. And most of them said that they aren't currently sexually active, or that they wanted birth control, or that they were ambivalent about birth control. If they were ambivalent about becoming pregnant. They had experienced some side effects of birth control, and so they didn't want to continue birth control. So now let me jump into sharing some of the different quotes that the interview participants shared. Now, it was very hard for me to narrow this down to a small list, so I'm going to show a number of different quotes that came out of these interviews. I'll focus a lot on quotes that reflect their relationship with healthcare providers, because again, that's how most people get access to birth control. And it's important that they have birth control methods that work for them, but that depends on the access given by their provided. We know that by their provider, we know that the most effective are IUDs, intrauterine implants. And
So I will let you read the slide and then I will discuss more in depth. So this quote here says, and I feel like for most gynecologists, because I've had quite a few, I think, I would say quite a few, and it just seems like the only thing that they want to do is give out birth control. It's like you can come in because I don't know, you're just having pain down there, or let's hold on, not pain. So like one time I went in and because I had bacterial vaginosis, they said, the doctor on or the PA said, and she treated that, but when she wanted to give me a birth control pill, why are you giving me birth control pill? Like, why am I even hearing about this when I came for this? So that's just, yeah, I don't like that. And this was a hearing Black 34-year-old woman. So there's really not a lot for me to say about this one because it's very clear. The woman was not sure why the doctor provider was giving them birth control or offering that when that's not why they came for. Okay, and then this next one says, but if it's something like emotional or something related to sex or something, then I do like to have an interpreter so I can really ask more questions. Not that I ask like such super in-depth questions, but I'll sort of ask what maybe the options are and they'll tell me a little bit. And honestly, I don't feel like I get enough information, especially if it's just my PCP. And this is a deaf white 36-year-old woman. So there are two things I want to unpack a little bit more here. If you think about wanting to talk about something more in depth, the person might want to request an interpreter, but if they have to think ahead, we can't always think ahead before we arrive to a doctor's appointment about what we want to talk about or what might come up in the situation. So this person may end up without an interpreter and not have sufficient information or be able to discuss fully with the provider. Also, relationships in general can be difficult with and without an interpreter. The next quote I'll show here, it says, yeah, they would just say, are you sexually active? Are you using condoms? And that was it. I'm just like, yeah, okay, whatever. That was a deaf Black 37-year-old woman. So if they just respond real quick and then they leave and there's not any opportunity to discuss more in depth or further with the provider, which can be a definite issue. Now here are more issues. This quote says, usually armed with the information, I go to my doctor's office, gynecologist or whatever, and I'm like, well, this is the research I did. What do you have to say about it? Because this is what I'm looking at. But you can tell me what you think or whatever, and we'll go from there. And I'll base my decision based off of what you're telling me and what I've already researched. And I don't know whether they're annoyed or not because I usually go in knowing way more than I should. But usually, we discuss it or whatever. And that is a hearing Black 38-year-old woman. This is an interesting quote. While yes, I definitely advocate the ability for individuals to have knowledge about their own health, but that feeling that you have to arm yourself with information before you go to the doctor, that's a strong word. And I don't know if, the provider feels like I'm the one who knows what I'm talking about and you come in telling me things. So that's another layer of stress or um, decision making. This next quote says, I was asked if I was on birth control and I said no. They asked if I was sexually active and I said no. They said okay and moved on and never asked about it. They didn't ask questions or seem interested to have a conversation about it and ask if I might be interested in it for the future. They never said, if so, let me know and I'm willing to help and make sure you make the right choice and do what best fits for you. None of that. And this was a deaf, mixed race, 26-year-old woman. The previous slide had a quote of a woman who asked a question about birth control, got a real brief answer, and then went on. That was a deaf Black female. Now, this deaf mixed race female has a different experience. They have a lost opportunity to develop a relationship with their provider, or their provider lost the opportunity to help them learn about options for their future. Next quote, my family doctor emphasized being careful that I was not ready because of my age. However, my OBGYN was more of an uncomfortable experience as he was much older and a male. I was 18, 19 years old when I transferred to my OBGYN, and it was uncomfortable because he saw me as young and told me I was not ready for sex. Still, when he discovered I was not sexually active yet, I was not comfortable asking him and preferred to ask my mom if I had questions. This was a deaf, white, 20-year-old woman. For this slide, I tried to choose different quotes that showed a variety of ages and races to demonstrate that there are issues across age groups and across races. Now, I'm not saying that all experiences are the same, but there is something going on within all of these groups. I do want to add at the end, even though the doctor, they didn't feel real comfortable with the doctor, and they felt like if they needed to talk more, they would do so with their mother, which was great because it's important for people, including deaf people, to have positive experiences with their family. So these were some negative experiences. I will share some positive experiences on the next slide. I had an OB/GYN who was explaining things to me and did it in a sort of funny way. He was talking about ovulation and he explained it in sort of like a fairy tale kind of way. He said, it's sort of like weather because it's almost like the leaves falling in the fall. Your ovaries drop an egg every month. And so that was an OB/GYN who was a man, and he really sort of knew himself. And he just had this funny way of explaining things. So I think humor can be good. It makes you more relaxed. So humor and visuals are good. And this was a deaf, white, 29-year-old woman. I'm not sure if this woman had an interpreter or not. I just realized that. I thought about that. It seems this was very visual. It seems like she really got the picture really clearly. So it's likely an interpreter may have been there, and that may have helped her to understand it much more. ASL is a very visual language, and it can help people to understand abstract concepts or things that you can't really see clearly. And so I suspect this may have been this information may have been provided to her in sign, but also through pictures possibly. The next quote here says, the nurse practitioner, the NP, was the one who introduced me to those options. She educated me on all that sort of stuff, including like other things too, like eating healthy and losing weight. This was a deaf, mixed race, 35-year-old woman. So it's not just important to discuss birth control options, mental or sexual health, but You need to look at the person as a whole. Look at them holistically, their nutrition, their mental health, their reproductive health, all those things need to be taken into consideration. Now, the next quote says, I felt like there was no judgment. They had diagrams and pictures to show me, so it was very visual too. And I was able to, read all the materials, so that helps. And that's really my preferred method for learning is to read. And this was a deaf, white, 35-year-old woman. Again, this quote shows that more visual pictures, more visual options are much easier for people to understand. And again, take the whole person into consideration when you're talking to your patients or when patients and providers are interacting. Next, I focused on families and family dynamics. So this next quote says, I did have an opportunity to learn in middle school, but my parents forbade me from attending sex education class, and I admit I am disappointed about missing that chance to learn how to protect myself. I could have gone through different experiences if I messed up, but luckily my friends shared some information with me. I had barriers due to religion. There were no opportunities in high school for sex education. This was a deaf Asian 24-year-old woman. Sometimes family experiences are very positive. Some, like one quote I showed you, that person knew that they could talk to their mom, but this example shows that there were some barriers that prevented this person from talking with their family more in depth about what they needed to or felt they needed to. This next quote says, I think it was WXXI used to have this special. Was it WXXI? I think so. That would come out every so often back in like the 80s, and it was called The Miracle of Life. And we would watch it. My mom would make us watch that as a family. And this was a hearing Black 38-year-old woman. Really, I think it's pretty cool how the family encouraged and supported this education. They might not have discussed it in depth, but they made sure that this resource was available and they watched it together. Next quote, it says, I don't think there was any discussion about safe sex or like how people have sex or condoms. My family is from Haiti, so, kind of strict. And it was basically just like, no sex, that's it. Get to go to school, get your education, don't have sex. And this was a deaf, mixed race, 35-year-old woman. Again, there may be religious or family beliefs or other traditions or beliefs that may prevent education of these issues. You can see a lot of these things come up across. Okay, next quote says, only one class in high school talked about safe sex, not birth control. Very superficial. Told us not to do this and to do that, but nothing explained in depth. Told us to have safe sex and wear condom and ask our parents if we have questions. But some of us are not comfortable asking our parents, though. This was a deaf, mixed race, 26-year-old woman. This quote or something similar came up a lot where the school says you should talk to your family or vice versa. But no one should assume that the conversations are happening within the family. Some do, but many don't. The next quote here says, it was kind of confusing because I felt like they were pushing, their abstaining agenda without giving an opening for discussion or the alternatives. And actually, there were a few girls in my graduating class who ended up getting pregnant. And even then it was a taboo subject. This was a hearing white 33-year-old woman. I think when most of us think about the negatives of sex education in school, this is one of them. It's very superficial. They tell you not to have sex. They don't tell you the other options or things that you can prevent. And that is not sufficient. That's not beneficial enough because there are obviously unplanned pregnancies still. The next quote here says, no. So, first of all, my family is from Jamaica, so we did not talk about sex. That is off limits. My mom, yeah, did not talk about sex. So, I learned about, like, my body and sexual health and stuff in school. Thank God, because if not, I don't think that they don't really have sex ed class anymore today. So, I'm really grateful that I had that, because if not, where would I be? This was a deaf Black 37-year-old woman. So even though they had sex education in schools, or we do, there's always room for improvement. Sometimes family won't talk about it. Sometimes the school will, and they can get the information they need there, or vice versa, but we can't depend on one or the other.
There were also some quotes about informal sex education from peers. The first quote here, but I didn't talk about it with friends until college, when that's really when we started finally having open conversations about different types of birth control and, like, new things coming out like the IUD, because I had never really heard about the IUD before college. This is from a deaf white 29-year-old woman. So it's really important that that conversation was going on with their friends. Even though they had never talked about it before college, they were able to be exposed to these opportunities during college. So that means that this person never had sex ed from their family or from school up until college. And I just noticed a comment that was made in chat. And yes, I absolutely agree that the issues are often from providers. And not only that, but also talking about what we can do next with the healthcare system to better serve their patients. So we need to talk about not only patients, but also the healthcare system as a whole. The next quote here, my OBGYN didn't mention the IUD or the implant until later I found out through my mom and through my friends. And then I asked my doctor about those. And so then she talked about that. This is from a deaf white 23-year-old woman. I think this ties in perfectly. The doctor could have had that educational moment before, and they didn't. So the last but not least quote, later, I got to college. I met many friends who were using birth control. I did not have a lot of friends who took birth control in high school, and most of them started taking birth control in college. They were comfortable talking about it with me and shared, and I learned from them. I learned a lot from my best friend as well, but not from my family. Nope. This is from a deaf mixed race 26-year-old woman. Yeah, I don't think we even need to discuss that. That's pretty self-evident. So to sum up all of these quotes and some of the common theme between all deaf and hearing women, so first here, both deaf and hearing women felt that they didn't have enough sex ed in school or that it was delayed. And that includes both formal classrooms in school and informal, meaning from their family and friends. Often it was late, often it didn't happen until college that they were finally able to have those conversations with friends. And they also didn't feel that there was enough in-depth counseling from healthcare providers about the different options that they had. Their provider might have just offered pills, and so they took that, but they didn't realize that the IUD was an option or that there were other options until much later. There were also some issues that showed up only within deaf women. Most common was access to communication about birth control. So having to think ahead about requesting an interpreter, whether or not they would even have an interpreter. Most healthcare providers, of course, also don't use ASL. So there had to be an interpreter for ASL using patients. Some of them also found information online, but that information is going to be in English. Some information is more visual, but there's not much information available in their native language of ASL. And many women would prefer to have that information accessible in ASL, which is their native language. So here, let's talk about what works. So what supports positive experiences for both deaf and hearing women is open communication with parents and family. That doesn't matter whether or not the parents start the conversation. Sometimes the parents won't start that conversation, but they have a relationship that's comfortable enough that children feel comfortable asking their parents about that because that positive relationship is already there. And in visual aids, if the healthcare providers use pictures, visuals, or websites that use pictures and visuals, that helps people understand these concepts better. And then within deaf women, of course, we know that ASL access through an interpreter provides better support. It's important for them to have better relationships with healthcare providers. And also consideration of conversations with friends in college. And especially if that's their first time getting this information, that can be a very positive experience. So let me come back to reproductive justice. I'm sure that most of you have seen this definition from Sister Song before, so I'll let you read this. Reproductive justice is defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And I put in bold the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, and I want to focus on that part for a few minutes here. So having personal bodily autonomy requires three parts. The first is comprehensive contraceptive counseling. That means that they understand all of their different contraceptive options, access to contraception. And the third is accessible information about reproductive health and contraception. And from what I just explained from the research background and from the interviews that I conducted, it seems that many women, especially many deaf women, do not have this. They don't always have full access to options about contraception or access to contraception itself or accessible information about how to use it. That information often doesn't come from the healthcare providers, and it can be iffy to find it online. And that's why I feel that we have reproductive injustice within the deaf community. So the important takeaway for this, for future research, education, and other areas, is to remember the importance of personal values. So regardless of a person is deaf, hearing, regardless of their age or race, family and religion plays a huge role. And then developing resources, it's important to ensure that everyone has access, that there is language available, that peers are included, because we know that the peer support system is very important to encourage that access, and that any messages should include these values so that people feel that this message is for them and they can better understand it and hold on to it. So I hope that you understand a bit more about the deaf community and reproductive injustice in the deaf community. And of course, we know that this doesn't only apply to the deaf community, but it applies to other communities as well, for better and for worse. We have a lot more work to do and a lot more research that needs to be done. I just barely got started with the research, and I hope to work together with other groups in the future. I'll open it up now for questions. And if you have any questions that come up later, please feel free to email me or follow me on Twitter. So I will open it up for questions now. And if there aren't any questions, that's all right too. I'll wait a few more minutes. I see one question. How do you think we can help to make the situation better? That's a great question. I think that we need to be mindful and consciously mindful of any education opportunities, any activities, be inclusive of ASL access, make everything as visual as possible. And really, visual access is not only beneficial to deaf people, but to hearing people as well. Anyone gets a better understanding of these abstract concepts using visual aids. In the deaf community, most of us are used to having to be assertive to ask about interpreters and language access, but that can be exhausting. And that adds more onus on deaf people to ensure that they have those access services. It's better for conference healthcare providers to provide those automatically. So, like this conference has captioning and interpreters already scheduled and already provided, and that's very helpful. And I didn't add this in the background, but some research on cancer, for example, on ovarian cancer and cervical cancer, as well as breast cancer, some research studies have found that videos, media, whether they include ASL, spoken English, and or captioning, they tested those videos with both hearing and deaf participants and asked if they liked it, if they would recommend it to other people. And both deaf and hearing participants liked it a lot. It didn't matter that they saw sign language on the video, even if a hearing person felt that it wasn't necessarily designed for them, they didn't find it annoying. They thought that it was still beneficial because it still had access to information in spoken English. So ensuring that everything is accessible to everyone all the time, I think is very helpful. And I hope that answers your question somewhat. Thank you. Oh, and I see another question here. What did my medical school communicate about deafness? That is a great question. Um, I have to think about that for a minute. In terms of formal education, I don't remember anything specific about deafness. And I'm also from a medical school at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York. We have a very large deaf community, and so deafness is fairly well known. That doesn't mean that there is no autism or no oppression or no bias. Of course, there is. But I had the privilege of having a good support system that was provided for me to go through medical school. And I never experienced discrimination from patients. Whenever I would work individually with patients, I would introduce myself using spoken English with an interpreter with me. And I asked the patient if they could understand me clearly and said that if they didn't understand me or if they weren't feeling well, if they had any issue at all, to please use the interpreter. And that was never a problem. That worked very well. Every once in a while, I did have some issues in communicating with other providers, but um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that answers your question fully. I did go to the University of Rochester, so my experience might have been unique, and I can't compare with any other medical schools. There is also a program called Deaf Strong Hospital that happens at the University of Rochester, and that's a role reversal activity for first year medical students. When they first get to campus, they get to become the patients in a simulated hospital where everyone in the medical system are members of the deaf community. So the healthcare provider, the receptionist is deaf. Um, no one is using spoken English. Everyone that the patient interacts with is deaf. And so that is a good experience for hearing healthcare providers, future healthcare providers, to experience what that language barrier is like. So I think that's my answer of why I can't really answer your question, is because it's just so hard to compare. I hope that's enough. Okay, good question. What ways am I planning to target deaf women of color to recruit for my research? And how to consider that intersection between race and reproductive justice? Absolutely. I think that, like I said, I did try to recruit participants that were representative of the demographics of the wider community. And that has pros and cons. The pro is that I was able to interview a fairly diverse group, but we didn't ask about hearing status per se. And in terms of what exactly the deaf community looks like, we followed pretty general demographics. I hope that description makes sense. I used that approach because I thought that it would be the best, but now I realize that it might not have been the best. But I do think it's important to have more in-depth conversations with women of color and to actively, intentionally recruit them. I did, like I said, I did make an interviewer available who was a woman of color, but maybe I should have encouraged other women of color to interview with that person specifically instead of just offering them the option. But this is ongoing work for me, absolutely. And the next question here, what would a comprehensive sex ed course for schools that is inclusive of the deaf community look like? That's another great question. I have been thinking about that in terms of my next steps. I've been thinking pretty broadly about my next steps. And for better or for worse, I think there are a lot of different options. So we do need to focus on medical providers, on their relationships with patients, and on schools, on sex ed within diverse communities, and also focusing on parents. So there's a lot of work, and I can't be the only one doing it. Other people need to be involved in this work too. But I have been thinking about what school sex ed should look like. We shouldn't have children and teens waiting until they get to college to learn about contraceptive options and sex ed that should be offered in schools. So, of course, I think that sex ed should be more visual. It should be more fun. It shouldn't be very awkward where the boys are put in one room and the girls are put in another room, like what typically happens, or the gym teacher offers a very superficial sex ed class. That also shouldn't happen. That was my experience with my gym teacher in school, and that was very awkward. I think that there should be discussion of different topics within a shared group. And there should also be other platforms. So perhaps a person could take sex ed on a computer using self-paced modules, but then also have an instructor ready if there's any parts that they don't understand or to provide support. So I have seen that approach too, and I think that could be effective for the deaf community. I think that could be effective for anyone really. So I think I see another question here. Is there education being provided to deaf males also, or research on their experiences with doctors also? That is a great question. I focus on research with women, but I don't intend to exclude men. It takes two to cause an unintended pregnancy. And I think that the thoughts of women in terms of selecting their contraceptive use, sometimes men are involved. It's also a question of whether men should be involved and how they should be involved. So it should be the woman's choice, but men should be aware of it. If there is a child of the relationship, then the father needs to be able to support their child's education and development as well. So my work hasn't included men yet, but I think it should, absolutely. Any other questions? Comments? Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this topic in the deaf community. This is a passion of mine, and there is a lot of work left to do. We need more people involved. Again, I'm a white cisgender woman, and I can't be doing all the research. I need to have diverse perspectives involved, and diverse members of the deaf community, and people with other identities. I think that everyone needs to be involved in this discussion, and we can't only talk about the deaf community while excluding other communities. Again, what we develop for one community benefits everyone in the end. Okay, so if there are any other questions, if not, we can end a bit early. I'll give you some extra time before the next session. All right, thank you. Thank you everyone for your patience with technology. There's always something that happens with technology, right? I think we're all used to that by now during these weird times of our lives, relying on technology and Zoom so much more than we used to. All right, well, thank you everyone. I hope that you enjoyed this session and I hope this session was beneficial to you. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Okay, so host, I just want to let you know, should I stay and wait for other people in case they show up or should I leave? How should I handle this?
Um, Also, hi. Nice to meet you guys. Um, uh, you guys are free to go if that's something y'all want to do. You're welcome to stay also.
Okay. All right then. Thank you again and have a wonderful conference. Bye.
You too. Bye.